All right, welcome back, everybody. We are now going to look into the addiction pathway. As you can see by our figure, there's a lot that's going on. And so, again, this is really important, hopefully, to provide some education to decrease the stigma of addiction, in that there's so many different things happening. And so, you really need a multi layer approach to treatment and intervention if you're choosing to become a clinician or going into clinical or therapeutic sites. Usually, when it comes to addiction, signal pathways start to happen in the midbrain, which is at the top of the brainstem, and then it passes to the nucleus accumbens. So we have the top of the brainstem, and then we have the right and left nucleus accumbens right there. This is towards the front area of the brain. You can think of the nucleus accumbens as sort of the processing hub for the nervous system. It's connected to a lot of other parts of the brain and includes the limbic system. In prior videos before, we talked about the mesolimbic pathway. This is the pathway that's really important for dopamine. And so in terms of the nucleus accumbens, it's a big component of the limbic system, which includes the hippocampus. Hippocampus is important for creating and learning about memories and storing memories and encoding memories. The limbic system also encompasses the amygdala, which we already talked about in terms of anxiety and fear and stimuli. And it's also very important in terms of regulating emotional responses. And then overall, when you think about addiction, think about it from multi-layer approach. It's affecting the limbic system, which is really important for memory and emotions and different things like that. But it's also affecting the prefrontal cortex, the area that's right behind the cortex area of the brain that is involved in higher thinking skills like planning and attention. And so what you're getting with addiction is that it's impacting the ability to make good decisions, and it's also pretty much hijacking the emotional system, the emotional regulation system. So when you think of this system, think of anything that has to do with reward. This can be eating food, playing video games, walking outside, exercising, sex. All of those things are affected by the reward system. When you think about certain drugs like cocaine or amphetamine or opioids, those are substances that are also affecting the same pathway, but hijacking it in a way that we'll talk about later on kind of debilitates a lot of people when it comes to addiction. All right, so if we look at some of the things that are happening at a neuron perspective, here we have these releases of neurotransmitter, and the specific neurotransmitter in the reward pathway or the addiction pathway is going to be, you can probably guess, it's going to be dopamine, right? So dopamine is very important when it comes to reward. Anything that you do that's enjoyable, food, eating, sex, those neurotransmitters that are going to be released are going to be dopamine. It is the main chemical messenger that is going to impact reward or even addiction pathways. When you think about addiction, let's say, for example, for opioids, what opioid substances are going to do, they're going to be detected by mu opioid receptors. These are natural opioid receptors that are within your brain. And when it gets detected by these receptors, it triggers a huge release of dopamine. And over time, what starts to happen is that patient or that person gets addicted to that release of dopamine from that substance, either from the morphine or from the pain reliever. Whenever you have a certain substance, it'll bind onto that receptor and it will then trigger a cascade or release of dopamine. The other thing that's important to note is that when more opioids are consumed, so let's say someone is now continually taking more and more and more opioids, the same release of dopamine is triggered. And that trigger, as I mentioned, is kind of experienced as a high or euphoria. And it's remembered by the limbic system. right? So remember that limbic system is your hippocampus, which involves your memories and involves your amygdala, which is sensitive to danger and fear. It kind of hijacks that system because that emotional regulation becomes dysregulated. In other words, the person essentially becomes very attached to that substance for pleasure, for reward. Eventually, you get a situation that's happening where when the brain becomes continually overstimulated by the feelings of euphoria, it starts to make regulatory changes in the brain. And what that means is that the amount of dopamine receptors in those neurons in the brain cells become reduced. And so here's what I mean by that. It binds to these receptors, it releases that dopamine. Eventually, over time, there becomes less and less dopamine receptors because the brain is just overwhelmed with how much euphoria and pleasure is going on. It's an unnatural level of reward. Things like eating and exercise and sex, those are natural levels of reward. And so whenever you have a substance that can hijack this system to increase a flux of dopamine that the brain has never experienced before, you can imagine why the tolerance will happen. And also you can imagine that even when someone tries to restrict their level of opioid use, the withdrawal effects, right? The shaking, the dizziness, your body goes into a state of craving that substance. And I'll never forget how one of my professors explained it, is that you typically initially will want this drug, but over time, due to the tolerance, you'll want it less, but you'll need it more. In fact, your body, your psychology is going to crave it, is going to need it. And so even when that person is trying to quit and take themselves away from the situation, it can be very difficult to do so. Even though they don't want to be addicted, their body and their psychological system has been hijacked in a way that they're constantly craving this substance. That's where some of the neuroscience and neuropsychiatry of opioid use comes from. It's a very delicate system. And of course, I also want to be sensitive to a lot of lives that have been lost due to an overdose of opioid use. And so this is, of course, a growing topic in the States, in the world. But right now, of course, it is a very delicate issue. And hopefully this lecture provided a little bit of insight to that. With that, I will see you all in the next video.